welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week we're going to be looking at the film Sansho the Baliff, directed by Kenji Mizoguchi, a Japanese director working alongside the great directors like Akira Kurosawa or Yasujiro Ozu, and yet still remains a little bit almost a secret master, where I would put them of the same class as Kurosawa, maybe even a little bit higher in the depth of some of his films, and yet because he's not canonized in the same way, I think his films have been a little bit forgotten, and I wanted to cover some of them here today. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie by a different Asian director every single week, decide to review it, talk about what I like about the movie, and why I think you should explore some more of the director's movies. We want to cover the wide world of Asian cinema. The past few directors have been more modern. This time we're going to go back into the past, work alongside a peer of someone like Kurosawa to show you that there is more to Asian cinema than someone just like Akira Kurosawa, because the thesis of this series is, I think, for a lot of us, we learn about a major director like Kurosawa early on, watch some of his films, but then maybe don't do a deep dive into the history and the great breadth of amazing Asian cinema. And with this series, every single week, I'd like to introduce a new great movie from a different Asian director to help you explore, as I'm exploring myself, the great world of Asian cinema. So starting off at the top of the show, I always like to give some context and celebrate the filmmakers behind the movie. And I want to discuss briefly just why I decided to choose Kenji Mizoguchi and what makes him such a special filmmaker. So if you choose to decide to watch Sansho the Baliff, feel free to do that, but I also encourage you to check out more than just this film and many of his other films, because I do think he is a true master, like I mentioned, alongside a Kurosawa or an Ozu, or you could even say, one of the most important filmmakers of the 20th century. I put him in that kind of a esteem. And that's why I wanted to cover Mizoguchi early on in the series, because the last few filmmakers I've covered were more modern. They're still alive, they're still making movies, but Mizoguchi died in the 50s. So there's a bit of a tragedy to what we could have gotten. Japanese director working alongside Akira Kurosawa. And the series, of course, is called More Than Kurosawa, but Mizoguchi, particularly in the 50s and 60s, was seen as a peer, if not maybe a little bit of more respected. Similarly to Kurosawa, made a bunch of movies in the 30s and 40s, and then in the 50s really started to get international acclaim. Kurosawa got it with Rashomon, and then Mizoguchi got it with really Sansho the Baliff or Ugetsu. And unfortunately, though, unlike Kurosawa, who was able to make movies into the 60s all the way into the 90s, we never really got those from Mizoguchi. And I think as a result, he's been a little bit forgotten, because in traditional, film classes, movies that have been canonized, you learn about Kurosawa's Seven Samurai or Rashomon or Yojimbo, and even someone like Yasujiro Ozu, another contemporary Japanese director at that time, you learn about Tokyo Story or Late Spring. And Mizoguchi, I think, his movies haven't been as canonized or taught in schools like a Tokyo Story or Seven Samurai, and as a result, he's fallen through the cracks. And I compare the three directors because they're both all Japanese directors working in this time period, having great success, particularly in the West, in the 50s, where I think a lot of them made their prime masterpieces. But I also don't want to compare them too much, because they're very different filmmakers. Because Mizoguchi, what I think he brings to the table is he's a master of perspective. He is a genius at classical storytelling, oftentimes, particularly in this late period, taking Japanese folklore or historical kind of period dramas, and I think making them incredibly resonant and emotionally connecting. So he's able to give us kind of the perfect history lesson, in that he's able to give us the historical context of the time and the period, but also still able to emotionally connect to the story. And for movies made almost 80 years ago on the other side of the world, it's a testament to his filmmaking that we're able to emotionally connect to his movies. Because I think he's an expert at that perspective, at putting us in our character's shoes, but then also isolating the core themes of the story so that there is a universality to them, which is why I consider him a classical filmmaker. Because he's able to take stories like Sansho the Baliff, which is, a passed down kind of oral story from hundreds of years ago before he made the movie, and still make it resonant to someone like myself today. There is a classical nature to it, in part because of his ability to really isolate and understand the key themes of his stories and build the movie around that, so that the emotional context is still at the core of the movie. If you think about some of his movies, they're pretty easy kind of sells. Ugetsu, Men in Search of Something Beyond Themselves, Princess Yang Kui Fei, a peasant turned princess, even something like Sansho the Baliff, children separated from their mother trying to reunite. There is this simplicity to a lot of his films. And he's great at having this kind of 3-tier storytelling approach where we're able to have a personal arc of the characters, we're able to have the societal implications of the story that he's trying to tell, and then oftentimes his movies are set in the past, so there's a historical element to it. So he's great at isolating those themes, but he does that in part because of his visual prowess, where Ozu has a very still camera and Kurosawa has a very dynamic camera and exciting camera work. Mizoguchi's kind of in between, in that he has the almost painterly frame approach that Ozu has, in that he has these long takes, but he incorporates that with movement. Now, it's not as exciting a movement as someone like a Kurosawa. It's most of the time longer takes, but still, a pan across a hill, moving across a person, kind of a floating, gliding camera in many ways. And what that's able to do is help us understand the living, breathing world that these places are. So that even though we know that this is a movie made about, let's say, 17th century Japan, we're still able to feel like we're in that world. And the more we understand the world and feel like we're in it because of that camera work, then in turn helps the emotional connection of the story to resonate even more. So every episode I've been giving a director an American kind of equivalent or a Western equivalent. At the beginning, kind of by off chance, but I've liked how things have progressed. So the filmmaker that I think is maybe most similar that you may have seen their movies of would be someone like a David Lean, in that he also has that ability to make kind of epic and yet still intimate storytelling, and that he's also able to create the 3-tier storytelling system that Mizoguchi also is able to apply. Take a movie like Lawrence of Arabia, for example. You have that base human theme of something like greed. You have the societal impact of war in another country, and then the historical context of this very specific period in World War I. In the same way, you can take a movie like Ugetsu, who has this kind of core theme of ambition and rising above your status, combined with the more societal themes, I guess you would say, of profit during a wartime. And then also you could see the historical period of what I guess would be 17th century Japan and this kind of unique societal hierarchy that they have. And what makes Mizoguchi one of, I think, the best historical filmmakers of all time is because he's able to take a true, honest snapshot of the time period from everyone's perspectives, especially someone like the women's perspective. Many of his films have women and men be very equal and on the same foot, and sometimes even like a movie like Princess Yang Kui Fei, we're very much connected to and relate emotionally to the female characters of the story. It just happens to be that so many of the historical time periods that he looks at, the women are always left behind or suffering, and it's the men who can actually do the going out and exploring or have the power. And I think that makes him a really modern director in many ways, because he's able to understand the whole picture and understand both the men but also the women's perspective on things, so that I think I can appeal and resonate to a lot of different types of people, and then also still feels true because he's not taking a very individualistic look at a historical event. He's taking a real honest look at the very kind of masculine society of Japan during those time periods, and everyone's role within that, and who suffers and who doesn't, and what the relationships and the dynamics between people are. So I think ultimately Mizoguchi is a classical director in the best way, and he's able to take a historical time period, isolate those emotional themes, use technical expertise through his camera work to make us feel those emotional themes so more broadly than even some other classical filmmakers, and make sure that that universality is still there, so that a movie made almost 80 years ago it still resonates today. So now transitioning over into my thoughts and discussion of the film. If you don't know, the movie is about an aristocratic family who lose their status and landowning status and have to kind of be exiled away from their community, and during that exile, the children get separated from their mother and sold into slavery, and the mother has to go into prostitution, works at like a brothel, and the story is them trying to escape their enslaved status and reconnect. And when I first saw the movie, my initial thought was, oh, is this what people who like Shakespeare think? Because personally, I've never totally connected with a work of Shakespeare. I've always appreciated its themes of its theatricality and its big themes of war and love and aristocracy and war. And yet, I've never been able to get over that language barrier because I never totally understand what they're saying, and I need a translation, and I need to get that context that I'm never able to completely get on my first watch or understanding of a play, let's say. So what I really enjoyed about this movie is that it had those classical elements, important historical time period, different than my own, but still these kind of more larger, thematic, broad themes. There's no real super complexity to them, and yet it's still very easily accessible and easy to understand in this kind of broad stroke way, but still has a classical feeling to it. In the same way that you sometimes see a movie, at least I do, and I think, oh, was this based on a novel? It feels like a great American novel, or it has this kind of omniscient or melancholy oftentimes with a movie like A Simple Plan or Little Children. They feel novelistic in the best ways. Bridges of Madison County, some of my favorite movies actually feel novelistic. And this movie, what I like so much about it is that it feels like a play. It feels broad and theatrical in its acting style, in its historical time period. It tackles these larger themes, almost all the themes at once, and yet I was still able to emotionally connect to some of the main characters. So if we apply Mizoguchi's three-tiered storytelling approach to this movie, I think it helps us understand why I like the movie so much. In part because of that personal connection, where we have children trying to get back to their mother, and that theme of trying to escape your own circumstances and having this very singular focus on something, you can't help but feel for the character wanting to get back to just the status he was when he was separated as a kid, so that by the time we get to the ending, it's just an emotional catharsis on a deep personal level. That's interesting to me. Then you also have the societal perspective, I think, which is very interesting, of taking a democratic theme, a more modern democratic theme of everyone should be equal, and trying to apply it into this system of slavery hundreds of years ago, and kind of the dynamics of, well, you can't really mess up the system because there's landowners and they're technically own their own land, so they can do what they want on it. So the balance of freedom versus personal freedom, I thought was very modern and interesting, and I think still relevant today. And then the historical element, I think more seen through the position of women in the story, and how they're separated in the slave camp, and then the mother character, and what she has to do to kind of keep that hope alive of maybe seeing her children once again. It's a very kind of a blatant classical, but I think honest depiction of this time that still is able to connect with me on some of those more classical themes of redemption, revenge, love, family. They're all intertwined in there. So it is big, it's broad, it's theatrical, but it's also beautiful and really touching as well. It's an old movie that I still think feels very modern, because it's able to give us the intrigue of, oh, what was Japan like during this time? What were the political machinations? Oh, that's interesting. But then also connect that to the base kind of human drama that I've always connected to personally, of themes that continue to repeat throughout history and stories of redemption and love and sacrifice, all done in this really beautiful, painterly visual style. Mizoguchi was a filmmaker who was greatly celebrated at his time, but I do think has fallen off in recent years in terms of his overall respect. I think that's a mistake, and I think that when you learn more about his classical beauty and some of his amazing films, you will learn that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Sansho the Baliff, or if you've seen any of Kenji Mizoguchi's other movies. Ugetsu is a big popular movie as well, probably his most popular movie, but even some of his other films are very exciting, and there's lots of complexity to them as well. At least of the films I've seen, he's made like 80 movies, so I haven't seen all of them, but of his most acclaimed ones, he is quite talented, and I'm definitely going to check out more of his movies after doing a deep dive for this series. But that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.